On with the program, I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you Kirk Euler, Supervisor Euler of the 4th District. I met Kirk a number of years ago and been around him to see how he works and his administrative, his management, and his leadership capabilities. And my friends, we have an up-and-coming star in leadership in Placer County.
Thank you so much. It was the fall of 1990, and my father was one of the authors of Proposition 140, the Term Limits Initiative. During the last 6 weeks of the campaign, I was hired to drive a campaign motorhome from precedent to precedent throughout California. And believe me when I tell you, you haven't lived until you've maneuvered a Winnebago down the 405. Well, at one of these stops in the Ventura County area, I was introduced to a young assemblyman who was not only brave enough to show up as an incumbent at a function that was in support of term limits, but he was actually brave enough to speak to the press and the others that were assembled. Bold, I thought. When the time came, the young assemblyman stepped to the microphone. Through his words, his imagery, his passion, he transported me back to Independence Hall, 1776. It was the first of what would be many times that I would be moved by the knowledge and the historical perspective of Tom McClintock. During my first term on the Board of Supervisors in the early 90s, Tom served as the director of the Center for the California Taxpayer. His office at the headquarters of the National Tax Limitation Committee was actually right across the hall from mine. No better mentoring was ever received by any young elected official than that which I received from Tom. When I'd walk into his office after a particularly trying day at the Board of Supervisors, and his wisdom, based in the fundamental principles of free market, limited government, would flow. On April 15, 2009, when addressing a taxpayer rally on the steps of the Capitol here in Sacramento, Congressman McClintock implored the audience, think about how far we have strayed from what Jefferson called the sum of good government. Jefferson described it as, quote, a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. The Congressman summed up his remarks that day with this call to action, which I think is perhaps even more pertinent here 2 years later than it was when he first uttered them on April 15, 2009. The Congressman said, and whenever we get tired and discouraged, we're going to remember what the American founders first pledged in defense of our freedoms when they signed the Declaration of Independence. You remember the words. They pledged their lives, their fortune, their sacred honor, and they meant it. The Congressman said every one of them faced the gallows, but they signed anyway. Every one of them faced losing everything they owned, but they signed anyway. Think about how little history demands of our generation in defense of those very same freedoms. We're not asked to give our lives, only a portion of our time until we've set things right. The Congressman reminded us, we're not asked to give our fortune, just a portion of our resources to support the causes that will restore our freedoms. But our sacred honor, history does expect that of us in full. That we will focus our time and resources and not slacken or tire until we have retrieved our liberty, restored it, and passed it on inviolate to our children. Because, ladies and gentlemen, the Congressman concluded, if we fail that test, what history will demand of our children and grandchildren is unthinkable. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you the man who was Tea Party before Tea Party was cool, Congressman Tom McClintock.
And I want to thank every one of you for everything that you are doing in this great struggle for the future of our country. I want you to think back upon the last 2 years and all that has happened in those 2 years. It's the Tea Party that's made it happen. I mean, if you think about why is it that the American left is so vitriolic in its attacks on the Tea Party, the answer ought to be self-evident. It's because you're winning. Think back upon what all the Tea Party has been through since it gathered spontaneously just 2.5 years ago after Rick Santelli on CNBC. Remember what was going on there? That was CNBC is not a big cable station. This was a little financial news broadcast from the floor of some stock exchange someplace where he was saying, "You really want to pay your neighbor's mortgage?" And the whole floor just says no. And he said, "We need a Boston Tea Party again." And now back to the studio, and it went viral. And from the four corners of the country, the American people rallied to those self-evident truths that Rick Santelli invoked that day. And look at what's happened since then. One of the great watershed elections in American history. That's why the left hates the Tea Party. And if you think about what this movement has been through in these 2.5 years, I want you to also think of how Gandhi described the phases of the truth. He says the truth goes through 4 phases. Now think about the Tea Party and tell me if he wasn't talking about the Tea Party as well. He said the truth goes through 4 phases. First, it is ignored. Then it is ridiculed. Then it is viciously attacked. And then it is accepted as self-evident. So congratulations, folks. We're 3/4 of the way there. Ronald Reagan often said that the past 4 centuries proved that Providence plainly had a purpose in placing this continent between 2 vast oceans, preparing it to receive what Lincoln once called the last best hope of mankind, the American Republic. After the victory at Yorktown, the American founders began to realize that they had a fleeting opportunity to put all of the tyranny and injustice and corruption and misery of Europe behind them. And as Thomas Paine said, to make the world over again. And so this remarkable group of men, aided by the great thinkers of the Enlightenment, looked far back into history and deep into our own human nature and began to ask fundamental questions about the nature and purpose of government itself. What is government? It's an important question if you're creating one. What exactly is it? Well, Washington came the closest to the mark when he observed, government is neither eloquence nor reason. Government is force. Like fire, it is a dangerous servant and a fearsome master. That's a powerful metaphor for somebody in the 18th century. Fire was essential to heat your home and cook your food. But inherent in its very nature was also the ability to destroy your home and ultimately your neighborhood and your city. And if you think about it, government is precisely and exactly force. That's all it is. Every law that we pass, from the law that says you've got to stop at a stop sign to the law that says you can't punch somebody in the nose, every law ultimately ends up being enforced at the point of a gun. There are no exceptions. Government is force, plain and simple. So if force is the nature of government, and what's its purpose? Well, the founders answered that question at the outset of the struggle.